Good afternoon and welcome to today's Thought Leader Roundtable, a conversation on readiness. Today's conversation is part of a regular series of explorations of the key questions of what does it mean for all young people to be ready for life's demands at every stage, and what is it going to take to get there? Karen Pittman, President and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment, leads lively and candid conversations with some of the most powerful, boundary-pushing, influential leaders working to improve the lives of children and young people across the United States. Today's session will feature Jonathan Raymond, author of Wildflowers, A School Superintendent's Challenge to America. Today's Thought Leader session will explore questions such as, how do we actually put children and youth at the center? How do we strengthen adult capacity and commitment from the classroom to the citywide initiative? How do we address the power imbalances that keep us tethered to old definitions of learning? And what can superintendents really do about it? A little bit about our presenters today. Karen Pittman is President and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment and a respected sociologist and leader in youth development. Prior to co-founding the Forum in 1998, she launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as Senior Vice President at the International Youth Foundation. Jonathan Raymond is the former Superintendent of the Sacramento City Unified School District, former President of the Stewart Foundation, and author of Wildflowers, A Superintendent's Challenge to America. He is a former attorney, nonprofit leader, school superintendent, and foundation leader. He spent over 4 years as superintendent of Sacramento schools, where he was dedicated to taking bold actions in support of the whole child. Last year, Jonathan released his book, Wildflowers, in which he shares the story of his time as superintendent, characterized by bold decisions and collective action to support children. Check out the book and other resources at wholechildchallenge.org. There are a handful of slides for today's session. We will be accepting questions and comments via the chat feature, which is available at the top or bottom of your screen. You can also share thoughts and questions via Twitter using the hashtag ReadyYouth. Today's session is being recorded. Next week, it will be sent to everyone along with these few visual slides. It will be sent to everyone who registered and also posted to the forumfyi.org website along with any additional resources that are mentioned on the call. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Karen Pittman.
Thanks, Ian, and welcome those of you who are on the phone. I am delighted to be able to have a conversation with Jonathan. I have gotten to know Jonathan over the past 2 years. We were both connected to the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, and quickly found that we shared a passion for this conversation about whole child and whole community. And so one of the things that I'll flag up front is that Jonathan entrusted me with the task of reading an early draft of Wildflowers. And I was so impressed, I think I sent him back a 10-page memo with charts about how I thought what he was talking about was not just important for school superintendents and school leaders, but was really important for everybody in the youth development world to understand, and that this was the first book that I had read in which I was really hearing a conversation about how to engage the community in authentic partnerships, and that's community in everything from parents to youth organizations to other public systems. And so as a result of that, I ended up actually writing the foreword for the book. And over the course of the last couple of years, Jonathan and I think have become friends. And so I'm delighted to get him introduced to those of you who are on the phone. We've got 3 quotes up on the screen that I pulled from Wildflowers, and it really is not only an easy read, it's a compelling read. So I encourage all of you who haven't seen it to look at it, and we'll talk a little bit more later about some of the things that the Forum has actually done with Jonathan and with the book to make it even more accessible. But Jonathan, I want to just start off by asking you to give us a little bit of the background on your journey towards ending up being the superintendent of the Sacramento Unified Public Schools. We all know that school superintendents are one of the most important jobs that are in our communities, and it's also one of the jobs with the highest turnover and a huge amount of stress and responsibility associated with it. So how did you get there?
I got there, Karen, sort of like a road in Boston. They're not paved in straight lines. So my career was really varied. as I look back at it now, my time in a nonprofit, my time working in Washington, D.C. for a congressman and a senator practicing law, all enabled me and gave me a really rich experience and a background and a set of eyes that I could call upon to simply ask some different questions. And when someone asked me, because I didn't have a traditional educator career pathway, where did my education career really start? It brought me back to the 6th grade when my parents got a phone call from the school principal saying that they wanted to move young Johnny back to 5th grade because he wasn't reading at grade level, that perhaps he had some kind of a learning disability. And they didn't call it dyslexia back then at the time, but that's what they were thinking. And my mother, who had been trained as a teacher, it didn't make sense to her. So at the time, and this is in the 70s, they brought me out and had me tested by a psychologist. And I tell people it was the 3 best days of learning in my life because we did puzzles, we did games, all sorts of things. And at the end of the 3 days, the psychologist told my parents, they said, look, there's nothing wrong with this young boy. He's just bored. He's shut down. He needs to be pushed. He needs to be challenged. He needs a different learning environment and experience. And if I were you, I would find him a school and a classrooms that have that sense. And so they were fortunate. They were able to move me to a school. And I love to tell the story that in my first class in my new school, halfway through my 6th grade year, I land in this classroom taught by this man, Harry Boyajian, all of about 5'2". He was born in Turkish Armenia, had survived the Holocaust, moves to then Palestine as a young boy, is an international soccer star, a teacher, head of an all-boys school, and at the age of 55, around my age, he emigrates to the United States, and I end up in his classroom. It was a geography classroom, which of course at the time I thought was the study of rocks. But Harry Boyajian had a way of making learning come alive. His classroom was filled with maps. And while I had never left Massachusetts as a young boy, I traveled the world in his classroom. And in the very first week, I had to take a test. And that next Monday morning, he came around to our desks, which were bolted into the floor, 4 layers of varnish. Everyone on the call knows what that classroom looks like. And he had his papers in his hand. And as he came over to me, and I was almost shaking in my seat, he looked at me right in the eyes and he just shook his head. And he said, young Raymond, I felt sorry for you. You weren't even in my class a week and you had to take a test. And then he looks at me and he hands me back my test. And he says, but what a job you did. Even you knew where Mesopotamia was. And as he hands me back that test with his arm on my shoulder, and I saw a red 73 circled in the upper right-hand corner, which I can still see today, he made me feel like I had a 93 because that hand on my shoulder, the look into my eyes, told me more than words that young Raymond, you could be somebody. You might even be smart, that I believe in you. And while I know you don't even believe in yourself. And as I think back now at that experience, that message that he sent, that adults believe in young people, often before they believe in themselves, that they can be somebody, that these relationships that get established between young people and adults, they create the foundation in which learning is able to happen and really just explode. And so it's with that in mind as I moved forward and I think back about how could I put my arms literally around as many children as I could in my time in education, and now to have them have a sense of who they are, a sense of believing in themselves, confidence that they too can do it. And that to me has been the experience that I have, that's really propelled me as I've moved through my career, and then really wanted to be a superintendent because superintendents have an unbelievable ability to make an impact and change within the communities in which they're fortunate to be able to lead, if they use the tools and the things that are at their discretion and within their hands.
I've heard you tell that story before, but I love hearing it every time you tell it. And I really do like the fact that you sort of draw this straight line between that powerful educational experience that you had as a young person and that commitment to be able to do this with other young people. So we've got these three quotes that I pulled from the book up on the screen. And for me, they really sort of reflect the essence of your philosophy. And we're going to dig in more to have you give examples of how you really put that philosophy into practice over your 4 years. But, you know, the first quote that's up on the screen, as you say, is pretty standard. We all know this, that the effects of poverty on a child's academic performance are varied and documented. I think the fact that you then pull out this idea that there really are not just sort of pressures that interfere with learning, there are also things that are missing from an enrichment perspective that really do influence young people's lives. And the thing for me that's most powerful by the time we get to the last slide, and I'll just have you jump in here, is the commitment that you made early on to get those things that really enrich learning back into young people's lives. And so what's powerful for me about the book and these particular quotes pulled from it is that commitment to really look for those opportunities to enrich young people's really social and emotional well-being. Not so much talking so much about building their skills, but I like the broader language of social emotional well-being and social emotional confidence and confidence that young people have. Looking for various opportunities to make sure young people have those opportunities to really build that sense of self and self-confidence and trust in adults that you felt in your life, regardless of where they come from. And then also your commitment to do this by broadening out the adults in their lives, looking at all the adults in the school, and then looking at the community. So let me start first by asking you to sort of describe your philosophy of leadership, which you sort of came into the district with. And I've heard you talk about your commitment for what you did in the first 100 days. What for you sort of makes a powerful educational leader?
One who listens and one who gets out into the community and hears firsthand what the community is thinking about, what they're concerned with, what their hopes and dreams are for their children. These are the most powerful examples that I like to share with educators today. That when I came to Sacramento, I had a good sense of how I wanted to see the work unfold. In other words, I wanted us as the adults in the system to figure out how to work together better. And that includes with our families and with our community. I also wanted us as the adults in our education community to be able to figure out how were we going to get a little bit better at all the things that we were supposed to be doing, right? Those two buzzwords today are collaboration and continuous improvement. But they're hollow words unless you really put them into action. What I didn't know was the what. In other words, what we were going to focus on, because I knew those answers would come from the community if we took the time and we created the space to go out and ask. And so in those first 100 days, and even the days after, for the 4.5+ years I was in Sacramento, I was rarely in my office. In fact, I would sometimes joke, if you want to come see me, don't come down to the Cerna Center, because I won't be there, as I'll be out in the community, I'll be out in schools, I'll be in classrooms. I was willing to meet with anyone who gave me 5 minutes of their time. And I heard a lot of things. Mostly what I heard was from a community that wanted to be involved, that wanted to help, that really took this notion of, could we put children first? Could we make decisions that were in the best interests of kids? Can we put that to a test? And let's do it here in Sacramento. And that's really powerful. And you don't get that as a leader if you're sitting in your office. And you don't get that if you surround yourself with people who are simply from within the system. And that was a powerful example of how we approach some things differently. I looked to put people on our team that had been in the classroom. I looked and had one of our first chief of family and community engagement. She ran a nonprofit organization in Sacramento that was focused on helping our Hmong children and our Hmong families feel more engaged in schools and in the community. And so I look to bring those voices in and to surround our leadership with that. But it all starts from a commitment to listen. And it starts from a commitment and a willingness to say, hey, I know we're the educators here. And in the case of Sacramento, we were a huge employer with a multi-million-dollar budget. And there's a power that comes along with that and a reputation. But I wanted to just let folks know that I was another voice around the table in this community. And when you tell people and show people that you're open to their ideas, that you are willing to listen and involve them and engage them to be part of the conversation, it may take a little longer, but you run a lot farther.
And talk a little bit more in specifics about some of the folks you talk to. And you talk to people in the community, and you also talk to people in the schools. I know you spend a lot of time going and visiting schools and talking to students and teachers and bus drivers and other folks who are in young people's lives. And so give us a sense of when you sort of say that community, that broader community of the adults who are in young people's lives. Who are the kind of folks that you listen to, and what did you hear that really helped you make sometimes some hard decisions?
I asked for a list of who were the important movers and shakers within the community before I even arrived in Sacramento. And I remember driving back from a vacation that summer before I even went to Sacramento, and simply using that drive time to make phone calls, introductory phone calls to these folks, to introduce myself, to let them know that I wanted to meet with them, that I was looking forward to working with them. Could they host a meeting or a coffee for me? These could be people from the Chamber of Commerce, our faith-based groups. We had both we had multiple parent organizations that were set up, from the PTA to other more formal groups that interacted with our schools. I introduced myself to the mayor and the city council and other local elected officials, particularly being in Sacramento. I remember, in fact, calling our state superintendent at the time, who was named Jack O'Connell, and I asked to come in to see him. He was shocked. He had never had a local superintendent just call up and want to come in to see him. And it was the building of those kinds of relationships. I asked members of our Hmong community and our Chinese community and our Latino community to put together meetings and to bring people together where I could meet. And when I would have those meetings, I would always close by going around the table asking them, if they were superintendent, what were one or two things that they would focus on, or what advice would they have for me? And I remember at the end of this one meeting when I asked that question, and as we went around the table, a young mother-to-be having her first child said to me, she said, "Just superintendent, just take risks for kids. Just take risks for kids." And that stuck with me. And yes, in those first 100 days, I visited every one of our schools, and I visited all of our facilities and met and kept that on a regular schedule. I created a student advisory group where I could meet with representatives from all of our high schools, which I did every couple months in order to get their input and their ideas. So these were just things that I kept up with. And when somebody suggested, well, you need to go meet with this person, I would go meet with them. I remember meeting with the president of Sacramento State College, which was a good 2 miles down the road from our district headquarters. And when I went in to see him at the time, he was in his 8th year. And he said, I've been here 8 years and I have never had a meeting with one of your predecessors. I met with a local philanthropic organization who said he had been trying to give the school district $50,000 to help establish community gardens, but nobody had returned his phone call. And there were so many stories like that, Karen, that went on and on and on of a school district that I think had this mindset that, you know, we know what's best for kids. We're in charge of the learning here, and you know, we're going to go about doing it. We had virtually no summer programs for our young people. It was when I got to California in 2009, and it was not even at the bottom of the fiscal crisis that was hitting at the time. But the prevailing sense at that time was, look, we need to shut our schools down in the summer. We need to turn off the lights. We need to turn off the air conditioning. That's the only way we can save money. Well, you know, that's true. And when, as the first quote says, 75% of your children come from families that live in poverty, what that means is in the summertime, you know, they're sitting around home, perhaps watching TV or on devices now today at best, or maybe they're out in the streets at worst. These were some of the more violent times in our community in the summertime. So we needed to do something about that. We needed to change it. And when you don't have the resources, which at the time we were about $6,500 a child in Sacramento, you know, we couldn't do this without creating partnerships, say with the city of Sacramento, with our partners at Sacramento State and others to create opportunities. Now we needed to look for opportunities, but we needed to look for these important partnerships. And when you change that mindset of being sort of closed to now open for business, open to ideas, open to partnerships, it's amazing what can happen for young people.
So I know that, as I remember in the book, there's a very powerful passage where you talk about literally sort of having the chain link fences around the buildings and playgrounds unlocked. Who filled those buildings once you did that, and what kind of response did you get? And talk a little bit about, I know a little bit about Sacramento, so I know it has, you know, a sort of a vibrant sort of youth development community in terms of youth organizations and networks that are working with young people. What role did they and others have in both helping you create those summer activities for young people?
I remember in my first early days, as I would go around neighborhoods and I would go on weekends, I'd be driving through neighborhoods that had every home was fenced in. There were barking dogs, not a lot of open space. And I'd look across the street and there was a school with a beautiful playground, with a fence that was locked. And again, it was like we were saying, we're closed for business. And I was like, well, what would happen if we in fact took the locks off? And I remember being told by some folks in the district who were like, well, our schools will get destroyed. They'll get vandalized. And I'm thinking to myself, well, our schools are part of a community. They're the center of neighborhoods. And what if we flipped that and said that our schools are actually part of the community, and that our green space is open, and that our libraries, because at the time, many of the public library branches in Sacramento were closed. What if our libraries were open for the neighborhood? And what if we had our media labs and technology labs? In fact, what if we gave a space in every school to parents and said, you do with it what you want. You can have education classes here. We'll put a computer in it for you. You can have coffee, whatever you want. In fact, that's exactly what we did. And in that first fall, I asked every school to have a welcome night for the community and for the neighborhood, to simply open up and invite the neighborhood to come into the school, to show them the library, to offer that room up for parents, and to explain how on the weekends the playgrounds will be open in return for their support. And I remember going to one school that night, and a neighbor who had lived across the street for 30 years came up and said, you know, Superintendent, I've lived across the school now for 3 decades, and I've raised my kids and they're gone. And this is the first time I've ever been invited into this school. And there were so many stories about that. And in that first winter break and vacation, where again, we would experience tremendous vandalism in our schools, when we changed this dynamic, and when we opened up and we asked our schools, we asked our neighborhoods and communities to, keep an eye out for our schools, we dropped our incidence of vandalism by 40% that very first year we did this. And that was just one example of the kinds of things that we started to do to change how we were positioning ourselves within the community. That first summer, when we were fortunate at the time, there was a grant opportunity named in honor of the late Senator Ted Kennedy. And it enabled us to apply for a grant to establish what we called our Summer of Service program, which we saw, as so many know on the call, that those transition times into middle school and into high school can be very challenging for young people. So we wanted to offer a program through partnerships, not only through this federal grant opportunity, which we were able to apply for, but by partnering with local nonprofits within Sacramento, and in some cases, the city of Sacramento, to create this program. And it was very simple. We had opportunities for incoming middle school students and incoming high school students to start right on day one of summer vacation, to go into their new middle school or high school for a 4-day, 5-week program in which they would come in and they would be able to design a summer learning experience that would be able to be a community service project of their own creation. They would work with upperclassmen in those schools who also came in to help, who were mentors and peers. And if you can imagine, right, as school starts in September, these young people, they've been on the campuses of their new schools. They have met their new classmates. They know upperclassmen, and they've met some of the teachers, and they have a community service project that they've been working on of their own design. It could be, we want to help homeless people within our community. We want to create a program to help people that have drug addiction. We want to find a way to bring more music or other kinds of activities into our school, and that they can continue to work on. And I'll give you 2 examples. One was a teacher who I visited in that first summer, who said that I've worked in this district for 8 years, and this is the first time I've really felt like I've gotten to know my kids, was in that space that they had to be creative, that wasn't guided by a lesson plan. And I love to tell this story. The first day I drove by one of our high schools, the first day of summer vacation, it's 7:30 in the morning. There's hundreds of kids lined up outside of that high school to get in for the first day of Summer of Service. Now, if there's one thing teenagers do really well, it's sleep. And on the first day of summer vacation, to have these hundreds of young people lined up to voluntarily go into this program, it really tells you something, that they were engaged, they felt valued, they had a voice, they were present, they were learning things that were important and had meaning for their communities. And you had other young people who got to be mentors and peers who felt a sense of value. And these are so important qualities that we need to instill in our young people. Ted Dintersmith wrote a book, What Schools Could Be, and he talks about this word peak, where he talks about the importance of purpose and agency and essential skills and knowledge. And here in this one summer program, we were bringing all that and more. And it just impressed me with the fact that when you create these spaces and when you open yourselves up to doing things and remembering that our young people, they live on 24-hour cycles. So yes, they're in school, and yes, they go home to families, and yes, they live in communities. And we have to take all of that into consideration and factor it in when we're really thinking about developing vibrant, ongoing learning opportunities for young people.
That's great. We've got questions beginning to come in, which is wonderful. I'm going to try to weave some of them into the stories that you just told. So just so concretely, for the summer programs that you created, in addition to opening the schools and getting organizations and volunteers in, were there any services provided? Did you provide breakfast, lunch? Were there anything else? Did anything else come into that space that required other funding?
Yes, so we served breakfast and lunch in all of our summer programs. In fact, we had summer feeding programs where we served breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because again, when 75% of your families live in poverty, what we learn to feed them in schools is what they eat. So we could feed them corn dogs, as my children told me on their first day home from school when they came to Sacramento. Or we could figure out a different way by, again, creating partnerships with local organizations that ran fresh food farm facilities, that offered ability to come in and to help prepare meals. All these things that we took advantage of. We offered health services. We set up a Connect Center, both at the district office that offered mental health, counseling, support, housing services to our families, and we set them up in satellites around the school district so that other families could have access that might not have transportation. We provided transportation vouchers. We even had summer athletic activities and PE activities, all in an effort to try to answer those questions. What do our children need most in order to thrive? And by extension, what do our families and what do our communities need? And how can we be a part of the solution?
That's great. I mean, I think there's a question that came in, and I think you've answered it came as a combination of, how do we address these big issues like racism and homophobia and systemic disadvantages? And then the second part of the question was, and how do we build educational environments where young people feel heard and valued and build self-efficacy? I think you've been answering the second part of this question perfectly. And I want to take people back to something that you said and remind them. You keep talking about the role of educational leaders is to listen and then take risks. And one of the things that you've said is that, that basically it takes courage to put young people at the center, because once you listen to them and their families and the communities, and you build those relationships of trust so that they actually give you answers, you then have to act. And I think you've said, once you give up that space, you can't turn back. And so to what extent in taking this sort of children first approach in which you listen and then begin to act, do you think you were sort of addressing some of the more sort of structural and institutional challenges that school systems often talk about and may address in very different ways? Is there a connection between those two?
There is. I certainly told our young people, as well as our parents, families, and community members, that absolutely we were going to listen, and absolutely we were going to involve them in decisions. But that didn't mean that at the end of the day they would always have their way. But I promised them that they would be engaged and they would have a say. And I wasn't afraid, and we weren't afraid to admit when we got it wrong and when we made a mistake. And we did that at the 11th and a half hour around a school closing matter, when it just really became apparent that we hadn't put forward perhaps the best decision. And so we changed course. And it's uncomfortable, particularly in the public setting and in the limelight, of having to say, we're wrong on this. We need to rethink it. We need to redesign it. But when there's kids' futures involved, it's okay. And I think we model a great example for our young people when we say we didn't quite figure it out. And sometimes you're faced with really, difficult choices. If we have to make reductions, where do we make those reductions? But I want to come back to something that we talked a little bit about earlier, Karen, which is the importance of relationships, the importance of creating classrooms that are welcoming and engaging for our young people. And it doesn't have to be complicated. I think that, and I want to be really clear with this, educating and developing kids isn't hard. Now, I'm not saying it's not hard work. It's really hard work. But we know what works, and we know what kids respond to. And yet sometimes we still continue to do it in different ways. In other words, this work of educating children, when you are involving families and communities, it's complex, but it's not complicated. But we do an overemphasis job on making things much more complicated than they need to be. So as an example of that, we can find ways to make our schools more welcoming. We can find opportunities, as they do in Waldorf schools, where the teachers authentically greet and welcome every student at the beginning of the day as they come into the classroom with a handshake, with a high five, with a good morning, Jonathan, look in the eye. And they close the day the same way. Now, I would submit that if every school and classroom in America authentically greeted and welcomed their young people and children into their classrooms every morning, we'd be in such a different place and having different conversations than we are today. And those things don't cost money. They take an extra moment, but think about the relationships. Think about the sense of confidence, of sense of safety, of resilience, and the emotional well-being we're sending and we're signaling and we're reaching for when we do something that simple. So I don't want to try to say that this work isn't about hard work. It's about incredibly hard work, but we don't need to make it more complicated when we really think about, what is it going to take to give he or she what they need most. And as the role of the adults in the system and in the community, it's our job to figure out, well, then how do we get those skills? How do we get the tools? How do we develop the competencies? How do we work together? How do we learn together? How do we share and spread the things that we know are working? That it's happening in schools and in classrooms every day throughout this country. Yet often we don't recognize them, we don't reward them, and most importantly, we don't replicate them. And if we were more intentional about that, we'd again be in a much different place. Now, to that first question around efforts around racism, homophobia, equity, these pieces, again, I think that as we really begin to focus on what do we mean by whole child, and what do we mean by giving every child what he or she most needs, when we start educating and thinking about the head, right, giving our young people these essential skills, the critical thinking, the ability to advocate and to control their own learning, to see the relevancy, the hands part of that, to see the relevancy of what they're learning in their communities, that we're really helping them to create and to be active problem solvers and address challenges that are real, that are today, that are meaningful in their lives. And when we can really open them up by getting at the heart, right, which is teaching our young people what it's like to have empathy, what it's like to have compassion, what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes, that differences are normal, that differences are real, that every person and child has their strengths and their areas that they're working on and their amazing qualities. That's why the book's called Wildflowers, because we're all so different and so brilliant at the same time. I think if we, by putting children at the center and asking these kinds of questions, figuring out what is it that each one of them needs in order to thrive, and then working as a community, as a group of adults to figure out how do we get there, we start to take care of some of those questions, because it involves our engaging our community. And as my friend Carrie Wilson, who runs Mills Teacher Scholars, said so eloquently that the road to excellence in our education system lies at the crossroads of academic learning and empathy. You can't have one without the other. And I think it's the latter part that we really need to be focusing in on if we are truly, I think, as in the vision of our progressive educators and those that stood on the shoulders of the John Deweys, the Maria Montessoris, the Rudolf Steiners, those with child development and youth development backgrounds who are now supported by the Pam Cantors and the Mary Helen Immordino Yang, the brain scientists who understand and they know how children learn and young people learn. We have all that knowledge at our disposal. And now the question is, and this is what I tell educators and aspiring superintendents, so what are you going to do with it? How are you going to act on it? Because it's about action and controlling the things that you can control. I would often joke when I was superintendent, I'd say, I'm in charge, but I'm not in control. And there is some truth to that. It was sort of a funny saying, but the truth is what I was in control of. I was in control of helping to create a shared vision from our community of what is it that we want our young people to be able to know and do. And the partnerships and the relationships that we needed to nurture and to strengthen in order to help us achieve that vision. And I was also in control of the message. And too often we forget how important communication is, to share those success stories and even the stories of struggle, because it makes this work human. And when we make this work human and when we use our stories, it brings people together. And it's the most powerful way of sharing ideas since ancient times.
I think that's, so many important things that you said. I'm going to ask Ian to take us to the next slide and build a couple of more questions in, as I know we're past the halfway point and getting to the last 15 minutes, and I promise to get all the questions in. One question was, you mentioned Pam Cantor, who was our thought leader on our last session. So for those who weren't on that last session, I want to remind people that so many of the things that you just talked about as being critically important for this whole child approach are really sort of defined by and reinforced by the science of learning and development, which has really looked across the brain science and everything that we have to suggest, as you said, that it starts with offering young people strong relationships, making sure that they've got those relationships in school and in their communities, and then making sure there are environments in which they feel safe and belonging. The instructional experiences then have to be both rich and rigorous and relevant for them. Getting to know them well enough that you can provide individualized supports or connect them to those supports out in their community, and then building these critical skill sets and mindsets and habits that you continue to mention as being so critical. So one of the questions was, how did you get teacher buy-in? And as I've heard you talk about it, it wasn't that you were sort of dragging teachers into this, although there may have been some, but I've heard you talk more about as you went into schools and found teachers who are actually using this approach, but sometimes almost afraid to suggest that that's what they were doing, you essentially sort of gave them the confidence and freedom to talk about how putting kids first really gets to the end goal of, sort of advancing, academic and more traditional goals. So talk a little bit about what you learned from teachers, how teachers were partners in this process with you, and also as you're talking about that, even though I know Sacramento was and is a community in which you've got a large number of young people in poverty, why is this approach good for all young people? How does it help young people who may not be coming out of economic diversity, but may also be feeling stress in their lives that leads to suicide or substance abuse or other things? So why is this good for everybody, and how did you get teachers on board?
Relationships are so fundamental in all of this work, Karen, and I know that when you talk about education reform models and practices, and and you say the word relationships, I know some people roll their eyes because relationships aren't sexy, but they matter most. I mean, they're so critical. At the end of my first day as superintendent in Sacramento, I ended up, and I was fortunate to meet with another partner organization, the Parent Teacher Home Visit Project, that trains teachers to go into their students' homes to begin to develop relationships, to break down the stereotypes and the stigmatism and the blame game, and to really begin to strengthen those bonds so that it's the teacher and it's family. You know, we're here to support students. And I was at Earl Warren Elementary School. Again, we had over 24 schools in Sacramento that were 100% poverty. 100% of the children in those schools came from families that lived in poverty. And in Earl Warren, virtually 100% of those teachers participated in home visits, meaning they went with another colleague and they visited all the homes of their children in their classrooms during the course of a year. And they start in the summertime. They start before school starts, and I went along. I tagged along on 2 visits my first day, and I would go subsequently at least every month, every other month. I would go along and make sure that was part of my schedule. And in the very first visit to the Castro family, I was a 2nd grade student. I was with Nancy Fong, and we went into that home, and in a high poverty neighborhood in South Sacramento. And Mrs. Castro had brought out her finest teaware, and she served us some tea and some grapes. And she's sitting there, and she said, you know, there's some days that I just want you to know where Mohammed might be late to school. And she said, it isn't that I don't care about getting Mohammed to school on time and that his brothers or sisters help with him. She said, but I'm a single mom and I'm battling cancer right now. And there's just some mornings where I can't get out of bed. So I don't want you to think that I don't care. And in that moment of just pure vulnerability, everything melts away. Everything about, you know, he or she or pointing fingers or blaming. And you suddenly realize the power of coming into someone's home and learning their circumstance, and then asking them, you know, Mrs. Castro, what are your hopes and dreams for Muhammad? You know, you realize that families don't leave their best kids behind at home, and they just send us, you know, their most challenging kids. They send us their hopes and dreams, their most precious, most beautiful creation in the world. And that they're entrusting us, and that we can't do it alone. And we were fortunate to have this partnership in our school district, and yet only 20-something of our schools out of 70 were really invested in the home visit project at that time. So we knew here was something that was really powerful. And that school, by the way, Earl Warren Elementary School, later in about a year became a blue ribbon school. Blue ribbon school, 100% poverty school. And this was one of their signature practices, developing relationships and creating environments where not only children felt safe, but families and parents did too. They had more parents and families coming into that school, volunteering, helping out, and it created a vibrancy. And so all those things that are listed here that Pam talks about were absolutely essential, and we couldn't do anything about it. We couldn't even get to the academic issues if we didn't have the creation and the foundation. And you realize that first, stressed children can't learn. I don't care where or what environment you put them in. If they're stressed, they're not going to learn. And at the same time, you have to realize that stressed educators can't teach. So what are we going to do about that? What supports are we going to provide to our teachers? How are we going to help them and work with them and train them? I sometimes think, and I went to visit a school in Oakland, and who was helping its faculty by providing mental health and support and counseling services to the faculty, because they were working, again, similar kind of school, high poverty, high stress school. And you'd work with a young person all week, and something would happen that night. They'd go back to their communities. They would see some act of violence, they come back into school and it's like they had taken 2 or 3 steps backwards. So that takes its toll on our teachers and our educators day after day after day. So how are we going to help and support them? So these were also the kinds of things that we focused on, Karen, which was, first of all, if we can give our teachers and our school leaders more time to work together with each other, to build relationships, to give them the kinds of supports. You know, what do you need for your faculty and your staff? What kinds of training? You know, we wouldn't send first responders out on the street with a basic first aid class. We just wouldn't. That makes no sense. Yet that's what we do largely in our education programs today when we're training and preparing teachers to work in urban school districts and high poverty communities. You know, we're not giving them the tools and skills and to be successful. And we often put our least experienced teachers and leaders in our hardest schools. Again, right? We can do something about that. As superintendents, we can do something about that. You know, if we're willing to, and if we're willing to have the courage to do something like that. And so that's a few of those examples of the kinds of things. It's not easy work, but it's work that can be done. And I would also say, right, that the resource question, and again, I don't care if you're Boston Public Schools with $24,000 a student or schools in California with, you know, 9 or 10,000 per student now. There's not enough resources to do the kinds of things that our young people need today, and the kinds of challenges and the things that poverty and stress will do, both for our young people and for our faculty and staff. We need the full resources of a community. But again, we have to be open for business, and that's a mindset and a belief system about how this work happens, where it happens, and who's involved in it.
All right, so I'm going to make the last question be about partners, and in particular about philanthropy and what role they played in this work. But before that, and before we leave this picture, you've been so inspirational about talking about the importance of helping teachers and really helping adults in general understand the importance of starting with relationships and sort of working their way around this wheel to sort of optimize the opportunities for development. And you've mentioned a lot of the challenges: time, training, trust, opportunities to come together. Are there other barriers? The question that's been asked is, why don't more educators utilize these strategies? And so I'd ask you to sort of see if there are other things that you want to mention, but also ask you candidly, when you came in to the Sacramento School District, what percentage of classrooms or what percentage of kids or what percentage of teachers, whatever you want, do you think were actually sort of close to fully utilizing these kind of strategies? And by the time you left, how much progress had you made? So any other things that are the barriers that we should be addressing? And how much progress were you able to make towards this whole child approach in the 4 years that you were there?
Yeah. So I think one of the barriers, and it's certainly under No Child Left Behind, but that's behind us now, were the accountability models and structures that were all about high stakes testing. In fact, this notion of not leaving children behind, it left the very children behind that it was trying to sort of shine the spotlight on, because failure and repeated failure at high stakes tests with no opportunity to self-create, to learn, to really show and deepen mastery, help to accentuate those very issues. So, but that's behind us now, and we have a new opportunity to take some different approaches. And let's be honest, that most of our educators today grew up in that environment. They were trained in that environment, and there are still strong vestiges of that old system that are alive and well. In fact, we still have high stakes tests and not enough of assessments that are based on what do children know and how do they demonstrate it, and do they get chances to continue to retake it. Performance assessments, portfolio defenses, whatever you want to call them. There are opportunities for that now. I would say we were a very traditional school district when I got to Sacramento, Karen. We had some schools that were participating in more project and more career-themed academies. We were part of the Linked Learning Network, which was at the time then funded by the Irvine Foundation, and some others that created opportunities for young people to follow interest and passion, to have workplace and work-based opportunities, to begin experimenting with things like performance assessments, and to provide some kinds of supports and counseling services. So it was a beginning, but it wasn't in all of our schools. And we went a long ways towards tripling from 8 or 9 pathways to over 20 by the time I left Sacramento. We even created whole schools that were dual language immersion, first Hmong dual language immersion school in the state of California, as well as other programs for our young people, a pre-K-12 international baccalaureate pathway program. And again, these all came from the community, speaking in various ways, or making themselves known about what they wanted to see, or what was missing, or what could you do. And when you have this idea of a vision which is open and which is really focused around the whole child, you look for those opportunities. You look for the chance to partner with the city of Sacramento around greening schools. You look for opportunities to work with local health care providers to bring more health centers into your schools. You look for opportunities to have more school gardens and more career pathways, and figure out a way to begin bringing in more portfolio defenses and assessments. You look for those opportunities when they present themselves, when you have the vision. I would say that today, still the things that are alive and well in Sacramento that continue to go onward are the career-themed academies and opportunities for young people, our summer and after-school programs, which so matter, as I love to say, big time for our young people in our communities, are still going strong, despite efforts by some to push more towards remediation. We're still feeding our kids extremely well. We have programs, our men's and women's leadership academies for our most at-risk young men and women who have the potential to be entrepreneurs or gang leaders, depending upon how those relationships and environments that we create with intention in our schools are being done, are still strong. And there's still an effort to really emphasize this importance of social and emotional well-being. Those are all things that are working in Sacramento. I've been away from it for a long enough time now, and I know that they are facing significant fiscal issues, and it's easy to get distracted if we don't take a systems view. I like to tell our aspiring superintendents that it's important that you need to be able to think systemically while designing locally, and that designing locally is from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood, and to always stay focused on that shared and collective vision, because it's as my friend Peter Senge likes to say, you use that creative tension. It isn't so much about where you are today, but about where you're going. And if you stay focused on where you're going, it gives you the strength and the energy to take care of the things that you have to do that always arise on a day-to-day basis in school districts. So, this work is never done, but it's important that we bring people into the community. As I like to say, we give them a mortgage to work within that community, and it's often finding people who come from the community, like Stacy Bell-Alt, who was heading up our foster youth work in the district. I remember seeing her present at a school board meeting, and she was incredible. She lived in the community. She raised her kids in the community, and within a short time, she was running all of our youth development programs. Patty Hagermeyer, our budget director, incredibly dedicated, passionate, committed, lived in the community. She became our CFO, and it was finding these people who, long after, as you mentioned, the turnover, long after, he or she leaves and takes their people they may have brought in with them. It's the Stacy Bells, it's the Patty Hagermeyers, it's the others who stay and work and live in the community, who continue to keep the work and the vision alive.
Well, Jonathan, you clearly can keep the vision alive. You're keeping the work going. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the end of our session, and we want to make sure that people know that they can both find you and that there are various ways to do this. So again, questions begin to come in at the end. Many, many more examples of how Jonathan both defined and executed this whole child approach, which really was about listening and putting the whole child first and engaging the whole community. In Wildflowers, Superintendent's Challenge to America, I really do encourage folks to order the book and read it. We have at the forum, we're so impressed with the book that we really have sort of deconstructed it and put it together in a facilitator's guide and discussion materials and created a topical index so that we can really help you and indirectly or directly really use the book to start these conversations. You know, one of the questions was, how do you engage administrators in this conversation? I can't think of a better way than to use this book. And if they don't have the time to read the book after you buy them a copy, you can reach out to Jonathan and engage Jonathan. As you can tell, he's a persuasive and wonderful speaker. We can help you sort of think through how to bring people together to have these conversations to get started. So you've got a slide up suggesting ways to get in touch. And we hope that you will grab the book, reach out to us, and get some of the tools and trainings associated with it, and perhaps bring Jonathan into your community or in virtually or in reality. But with that, I want to hand it back to Ian for a minute to tell you what's coming up next. And then we'll say goodnight or goodbye.
Well, thank you very much to Jonathan for joining us on today's session, and thank you to Karen for the insightful questions throughout today's session. I wanted to just ask everybody to please join us as we continue this series through the end of the summer. We have a session coming up on August 21st with Hal Smith from the National Urban League, and then we have another session on September 17th with Camille Farrington from the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. So please stay tuned and join us for these future conversations. And again, this conversation is recorded, and we'll be sending it out to all of you for further listening, or if you want to share it with colleagues next week. So thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks again to all, and thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Karen.